She was just trying to close a storage room door to keep the draft out. Nothing special. End of the day, basement level, alone. Cold air seeping through a gap in the old door frame that nobody ever bothered to fix. Her right arm was full of files. Her left hand reached out to push the door shut and brushed against a control panel mounted on the wall, something she had walked past every day for 4 years without ever looking at closely. Then a click echoed from behind the wall. A section of the wall slid open. Slowly. Heavily. The kind of movement that belongs to something that has been still for a very long time and has just been woken up. Behind it was a small room, one that didn't exist on any blueprint of the building. Didn't appear in any record she had processed in 4 years of data work in the basement. Inside, a safe. And inside that safe something with the power to overturn the largest financial empire in Chicago. Merritt Gale didn't go in. She stood at the threshold, looked inside, then stepped back. She closed the hidden door, walked back to her desk, and sat down as if nothing had happened. But the security cameras had captured everything. And on the 40th floor, at 11 o'clock that night, a man received an automated alert from a security protocol, one he himself had forgotten still existed. The alert reported that a contract employee in the basement had just triggered a bloodline verification protocol, installed the day the corporation was founded 30 years ago, by 2 founding families. 2, not 1. That man's name was Prescott Devane, 33 years old, owner of everything from the 1st floor to the 40th, and a few things the law doesn't put on paper. People didn't call him a businessman. They acknowledged him with a nod and a 3-step distance when he passed, because anyone who understood this world knew that the people who truly hold power don't need anyone to say their name. He set his phone down, looked at the name on the screen, Merritt Gale. 4 years she had been sitting in the basement of his building. 4 years he hadn't known she existed, but his father had known. 30 years ago, his father knew her family very well, and he had done everything to make sure no one would remember them. Everything except erasing that control panel in the basement. And now, a 27-year-old woman, the lowest paid employee in the building, carrying an old leather-bound notebook that once belonged to her father, and $47 in cash, had just accidentally unearthed what an entire empire had buried for 2 decades. The story begins here. If you want to know what the girl from the basement did when an entire empire came looking for her hit, like so this story can reach more people, share this video with someone you think needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The next morning, Merritt arrived in the basement at exactly 7:15, the way she did every day. The elevator doors opened, and there was the familiar hallway, the fluorescent light flickering in the corner of the ceiling, the one no one had replaced in 4 years. She set her handbag on the desk, turned on the computer, and entered her password. The screen came to life. The work folder opened. Empty. She clicked again. Empty. The entire batch of files she had spent 3 weeks restoring, every corrupted line of data she had untangled by hand, every encrypted file she had peeled open layer by layer, was gone. There was no trace left, no error notice, no deletion log, nothing to show that those files had ever existed in the system. She opened her sent mailbox. The email she had sent to the technical department the night before was gone too. The mailbox was wiped clean, as though she had never written it. Never asked a single question about the hidden encrypted data layer buried underneath the junk files no one had cared enough to look at. Merritt sat still, staring at the screen. Her hands rested on the keyboard without moving. 10 seconds. 20 seconds. She didn't call the technical department. She didn't call her manager. She didn't call anyone, because she understood, in the silence between 2 heartbeats, that whoever could erase data from the server, delete emails from a mailbox, and do all of it in one night without leaving a trace, that person wasn't sitting in the technical department. That person was sitting very high above her. And any call she made now would only tell them that she had noticed. She pulled the leather-bound notebook from the pocket of her coat. The leather cover was worn at the corners, darkened with time, softened in the way only something held every day for years can become soft. She opened it. Her handwritten notes were still there, blue ink on pale yellow paper. The names of the 2 founding families she had copied from the encrypted data layer. Devane, Hargrove, 2 names, written in her own hand, inside a notebook no system could access, no server could store, and no one could erase with a command in the middle of the night. She closed the notebook, and then she remembered something. 3 days before sending the email, she had printed part of the encrypted file. The basement printer was free, unmonitored, and she had a habit of reading documents on paper before analyzing them on the computer. The printout was in the drawer of her desk at the far end of the basement, the desk where she had sat for 4 years. But that desk was no longer hers. When she had been transferred to the 12th floor, everything on her desk had been cleared away. She hadn't been notified in advance. She hadn't been allowed to pack it up herself. When she came back, the desk was empty and had been assigned to someone else. She stood up, not hurriedly, not running. She took the elevator up to the 1st floor. The lost property room was at the end of the hallway, behind the maintenance room, a small room most employees didn't even know existed. She knew because she had worked in the basement long enough to know the things people on higher floors never noticed. The woman who cleaned on the night shift had a habit of collecting discarded belongings in cardboard boxes, writing the former owner's name on the lid, and leaving them here for at least a month before throwing them out. She did it simply because she didn't want anyone to lose something unfairly. No one asked her to. No one paid her extra for it. She just did it. Merritt found the cardboard box with her name on it in the corner of the room, wedged between a box of old office supplies and a stack of expired desk calendars. Inside were a box of pens, a few technical magazines, and a stapled stack of A4 size paper. The printout. Still there. Page by page, line by line, the encrypted data she had decoded, printed from the basement printer 3 days before everything on the system disappeared. She stood in the lost property room, holding the stack of papers, and felt its weight in her hands. It wasn't heavy, just a few ordinary sheets of A4 size paper, but it was the only thing still existing outside the system that someone had wiped clean in the night. The only thing they hadn't thought of, because no one on the 40th floor would imagine that a contract employee in the basement had the habit of printing documents on paper before analyzing them. She slipped the printout into the leather-bound notebook, folded it closed, put it into the inner pocket of her coat, the pocket with a zipper. The digital world belonged to them. They had servers, access rights, and the ability to erase anything on any given night. But the paper world belonged to her. And inside the old leather-bound notebook tucked into the coat pocket of the lowest-paid girl in the building, at that very moment, was the one thing the entire 40-floor empire above her head could not control. 3 days passed. No one came looking for Merritt. No one asked about the missing batch of files. No one mentioned the email she had sent to the technical department, and no one called her up to any office. The 12th floor was quiet. She sat at her desk, working on the ordinary files assigned to her each day, the kind of dull data no one cared about, and she handled them with the same precision as always. On the surface, everything looked normal. But she knew 3 days of silence didn't mean they had forgotten. 3 days of silence meant they were watching. On the morning of the 4th day, an email appeared in her inbox. Subject: Contract Employee Performance Review. Annual Procedure. Sender: Human Resources, 40th floor. Time: 10 o'clock that same morning. Merritt read the email twice. She had worked at Sterling Crest for 4 years. No one from the 40th floor had ever sent her an email. There had never been any annual performance review for basement contract employees. She knew this email wasn't about performance. She also knew she had no choice but to go. 10 o'clock. The elevator went up to the 40th floor. The doors opened onto a hallway unlike anything she had ever seen in this building. Not because it was luxurious, because it was silent. The kind of silence with intention behind it. The kind of silence that belonged to places where decisions were made without anyone needing to hear them. The small conference room stood at the end of the hallway, with glass walls on 3 sides. A man was sitting inside, already waiting. His posture was straight, his shoulders broad. The kind of man whose body had been shaped by discipline, not by a gym. His eyes were on her as she opened the door and stepped in, and there was something quick, precise, and undisguised in that look, a swift assessment that missed nothing. He didn't stand. Merritt Gale. Sit down. She sat. I'm Beckett Farrow, Deputy Chief Executive Officer. This is a routine performance review for contract employees. She nodded. She said nothing. Let him lead. Beckett asked questions. Ordinary questions on the surface. How long had she worked here? 4 years. What did her daily work involve? Data recovery, file analysis, processing corrupted files. Was she satisfied with her current position? She did her job well. What procedure did she follow when processing corrupted files? She explained briefly, technically, with nothing added and nothing left out. Then, in the middle of a question about system backup procedures, Beckett said in an unchanged voice, as though this were only another item on the review checklist. During data recovery, do you keep any private backups? Merritt looked at him. 1 second. She realized this was the only question the entire performance review had been built to ask. Everything before it had just been wrapping. I have a habit of taking handwritten notes while I work, she said. Personal notes, written in my own notebook. That's my personal property, not company property. Beckett didn't react. He didn't nod, didn't frown, didn't take notes. He only looked at her for a few more seconds, then moved on to the next question about monthly reporting procedures, as though the answer she had just given didn't matter at all. The review ended 15 minutes later. Beckett stood, opened the door. I'll walk you to the elevator. They walked along the hallway of the 40th floor. Merritt kept her eyes straight ahead, but when they passed the large conference room, she couldn't help looking. The glass door was transparent, completely soundproof. Inside was a long table, 4 men seated on both sides, and at the head of the table, there was one more man, the man she knew only through the name in the internal system, through the electronic signature lines at the bottom of company-wide emails she had never read carefully. Prescott Devane was sitting there. She couldn't hear anything through the glass, but she saw enough. The other 4 men were speaking. One man spread his hands, explaining something, pointing at a file. Another leaned forward, his voice seeming urgent even though she couldn't hear a sound. The third tapped his fingers on the surface of the table. The fourth sat still, but his eyes kept moving toward the head of the table, waiting. Prescott didn't react. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head, didn't take notes. He sat motionless, both hands laid flat on the tabletop, looking at the man who was speaking with a kind of gaze Merritt couldn't find any word for, except still. Still as deep water. Still as something that didn't need to move because everything around it had already begun moving in response. Then he spoke. 1 sentence. She saw his mouth open and close in less than 3 seconds, and the entire room went silent. 4 men, each with the bearing of someone used to power, used to sitting at important tables, all fell silent at once. One man stood. He said something, his voice higher now, the tendons in his neck standing out. Prescott didn't stand. He only tilted his head to one side, slowly, almost lazily, and looked at him. Just looked. He said nothing more, and that man sat down again, slowly, as though the gravity in the room had just changed direction. Merritt kept walking. 3 seconds through the glass door. Enough. She didn't need anyone to explain. The man sitting at the head of that table didn't run the company with contracts and quarterly reports. He ran it with something older, simpler, and far heavier. The elevator. Beckett pressed the button for the 12th floor. The doors closed. The 2 of them stood in the small space, white light overhead, the steady sound of the machinery moving around them. 35th floor. 30. 25th. Beckett looked straight ahead. His voice was soft, even, as if he were talking about the weather. Whatever you're keeping private, keep it somewhere safe. The elevator doors opened on the 12th floor. Merritt stepped out. She didn't turn back. She didn't need to ask whether that was advice or a warning. In the world where the man at the head of the table lived, the 2 were no different. After the review on the 40th floor, Merritt understood one thing clearly. She couldn't look for answers inside Sterling Crest's system. Everything she did on a company computer was being watched. Every file she opened, every link she clicked, every keyword she typed into the internal search bar left behind a trace that someone on the 40th floor could read at any time. If she wanted to know what the 2 names in her notebook truly meant, she had to search somewhere they couldn't control. The Harold Washington Public Library. After work. Merritt went there for the first time on a Tuesday evening, just after 7 o'clock. She brought the leather-bound notebook, a blue ink pen, and nothing else. She didn't use the library computers. She used the public records room, where any citizen had the right to access records. Illinois business registration records, archived Cook County court minutes, real estate transaction records, business license records, public data. No encryption, no password required, and no one watching who read what. She started with the name she had never heard before, finding it inside the encrypted data layer in the basement, Hargrove. During the first week, she followed that name through business registration records. Sterling Crest Holdings, founded 3 decades ago in Illinois. 2 founding sides, Devane and Hargrove. Ownership ratio, 50-50. She copied every number, every name, every date into the notebook, her pen tracing the hidden patterns of the past. During the second week, she dug deeper, records of ownership restructuring from the time of the takeover, which took place 20 years ago. The entire Hargrove family stake had been voluntarily transferred to the Devane side. The transfer document bore the signatures of representatives from both sides, and the certification signature of a notary named Franklin Avery. Merritt copied down the notary's name, then opened the civil records to search. Franklin Avery, deceased on March 17th of that year. The share transfer document had been signed and notarized on May 22nd of that same year. She read it twice. Date of death, March. Date of signing, May. The notary had been dead for 2 months before his signature appeared on the transfer document. That signature was forged. The entire voluntary transfer had been built on a document whose certifier was no longer alive to certify anything. Merritt sat still. She didn't write anything more for several minutes. Then she continued. She searched for her father's name. Gordon Gale, attorney, specializing in corporate finance. She found his name in the Cook County court records. Complaint number 73, filed in August of that same year. Subject: challenge to the Hargrove share transfer at Sterling Crest Holdings, alleging an invalid notarized signature. Filed by Gordon Gale, legal representative for the Hargrove family. Result: complaint dismissed, October of that year. She turned the pages. Civil records. Gordon Gale. Died in March, on Lakeshore Drive, 2 a.m. Traffic accident. No witnesses. 5 months after the complaint was dismissed, she had known her father died in a car accident. That was what she had been told since childhood. But she had never known that 5 months before his death, her father had filed a lawsuit against one of the largest corporations in Chicago, accusing them of taking over shares through forged documents. And the complaint was dismissed. And after that, he was gone. She searched for the final name. Her mother, Josephine Hargrove Gale. Hargrove, the surname she knew only as her mother's maiden name, the surname her mother had never spoken of, the surname Merritt had once thought meant nothing beyond a small line on a birth certificate. Josephine Hargrove Gale, daughter of Ellis Hargrove, the man listed as co-founder of Sterling Crest Holdings at its founding, 3 decades ago. Only daughter. Main branch, legal heir to the entire Hargrove stake that the forged transfer document had moved into Devane hands. Her mother wasn't an ordinary woman. Her mother was the heir to half of the empire, where Merritt had been sitting in the basement, processing corrupted files for the lowest salary in the building. Merritt sat inside the Harold Washington Library, the leather-bound notebook open in front of her, 2 pages crowded with blue ink notes, names, dates, case numbers. Outside the glass doors, Chicago was slowly darkening. She looked down at the notes. Devane, Hargrove, Gordon Gale, Josephine, Hargrove Gale, Lakeshore Drive, 2 a.m. No witnesses, all frozen in the records from 20 years ago. The signature of a man who had already been gone for 2 months before the signing date. She felt nothing. Or more precisely, she felt too many things at once, so they canceled one another out and left behind a very still emptiness at the center. She folded the notebook closed, slipped it into the inside pocket of her coat, the pocket with the zipper. Then she stood, pushed the chair back under the table, and walked home. The knock came close to noon on Monday of the following week. Merritt looked up from the screen. She wasn't expecting anyone. No one on the 12th floor ever knocked on her office door. Standing outside was an older man, perhaps the oldest person she had ever seen moving through this building. He stood straight, but slowly, the way a man stands when time has taken his speed but hasn't yet taken his sharpness. He carried no documents, no laptop, and had none of the look of someone who had come there to work. Merritt Gale? Yes, Monroe Hartwell, financial advisor. May I come in? She nodded. He stepped inside, gave the room one brief look, then sat down in the chair across from her desk. He didn't ask permission. He sat like a man accustomed to sitting anywhere he wished. He looked at her, silent for a moment, then he spoke, his voice level, direct, with no circling around the point. Have you found your mother's name yet? Merritt didn't move. Her hands remained on the keyboard. Her eyes looked straight into his. Inside her mind, everything was rearranging itself very quickly. He knew. He knew what she was looking for, and he had asked directly. How long have you known? She asked. Since the day you applied for the job, Monroe said. The name Gale. I knew what that name meant inside this building. 4 years ago, when your application file came across my desk for approval, I saw the name, and I knew. 4 years, Merritt said, and you said nothing. Monroe didn't look away from her. If I had told you, you would have started asking questions. If you asked questions, other people would have known you were asking, and some of the people who carried out what happened to your father are still inside this system. Not all of them have retired. Not all of them have forgotten. If they knew there was a girl named Gail digging through old records, what do you think would happen? She didn't answer. She knew the answer. I waited, Monroe said. I waited until you found it yourself. In your own way. In a place no one in this building controls. Because if you found it yourself, that meant you were good enough to protect yourself. If I had to tell you, it meant you weren't ready, and that information would only have put you in danger. My father didn't die because of an accident, Merritt said. It wasn't a question. No, Monroe said one word, then added, the person responsible wasn't Prescott Devane. The year it happened, he was only just a young boy. He knew nothing. It was his father. Silence. The small room on the 12th floor, the white light, the steady sound of the air conditioner running. His father is dead, Merritt said. Yes, 16 years ago. Prescott inherited everything. The corporation, the network, the relationships, the assets, and also the things his father buried, including secrets he doesn't even know he's holding. Merritt looked at Monroe. He sat across from her, hands resting on his thighs, back straight, eyes not avoiding hers. He wasn't an ally. He wasn't an enemy either. He was a man who had lived long enough inside this system to know the truth, and who had chosen silence for 4 years to protect a girl he had no obligation to protect. Why now? She asked. Why today? Monroe stood. Because you found it yourself, and because what happens next won't give you time to learn it slowly anymore. He paused at the door. Be careful, Miss Gale. He left. She sat there alone. That night, in her small apartment, Merritt sat on the bed and opened the leather-bound notebook. She had carried it with her since childhood, ever since the social care system took her away, and she had only been able to grab a few things. The notebook was one of them. She had kept it because it belonged to her father. She wrote work notes in it every day because she liked the feeling of writing on something that had once been his. But she had never read it all the way through. The first pages were her father's legal notes, his handwriting small, neat, precise, filled with terms that she hadn't understood back then, and that later she hadn't dared to read again because she was afraid of remembering. Today, she read, from the beginning, page 1, page 2, notes about contracts, ownership clauses, meetings her father had attended as the legal representative of the Hargrove family. Then came the later pages, the handwriting more hurried, as if he had written at night, written when no one was watching. Between 2 pages of notes about court complaint procedures, she found another page, completely different. Not legal notes, not terminology. The handwriting was slower, more careful, as though her father had stopped and thought for a long time before putting the pen down. If you're reading this, it means you've found the name Hargrove. Don't claim it back out of anger. Don't let it go out of fear. Decide for yourself, not for me. And at the bottom, the handwriting shakier, the ink paler, written with a different pen, perhaps on another day, perhaps in his final days. You don't owe anyone forgiveness, but hatred will turn you into what they want you to become. Merritt read those 2 lines 3 times, then she folded the notebook closed, placed it on her lap, and sat very still for a long time in the dark room. She didn't cry, not because she didn't want to, but because tears couldn't help her arrange data into a case file, and that was what she needed to do now. She stood, sat down at the desk, opened her laptop, and began organizing everything she had found over the past 2 weeks into one complete file, systematic, cross-checked, supported by source citations. She worked until 3 in the morning, by hand, in blue ink, with the precision her father had taught her through the handwriting she had carried with her for so long without knowing she was learning from it. While Merritt sat on the 12th floor, arranging data into a case file, on the higher floors, other people were also beginning to see things they didn't want to see. Genevieve Ashford wasn't someone who easily missed details. 3 years at Prescott Devane's side as his strategic fiancé had taught her to read this building the way one read a balance sheet. Every unusual meeting, every phone call that lasted longer than normal, every employee moved outside procedure, all of it was a line of data. And during the past week, There had been too many lines of data that didn't match. A basement contract employee had been moved up to the 12th floor without going through human resources. Beckett Farrow, Deputy Chief Executive Officer, had personally conducted a performance review for one of the lowest-level data analysts in the corporation, and Prescott, who never set foot below the 30th floor, had 2 irregular entries in his schedule over the past week that his secretary couldn't explain. Genevieve didn't know the details. She didn't need to know the details. She only needed to know that something was moving inside this building beyond her control, and anything she couldn't control had the potential to threaten her position. She called the only person she trusted enough to ask, Rowan Kessler. 60 years old, gray-haired, with a pleasant smile, he was the Devane family's longest-standing partner and the man who had introduced Genevieve into her relationship with Prescott 3 years earlier. Kessler was the one who had placed her on this chessboard. He knew every piece, knew every move, and most importantly, he knew every secret this 40-floor building was hiding. Kessler listened to Genevieve. Then he spoke, his voice ordinary, as if they were discussing the weather. There was a basement employee drawing Prescott's attention. The reason wasn't clear, but anyone who drew Prescott Devane's attention was a potential threat to anyone standing near him, including Genevieve. He said nothing more. He didn't say Merritt's name. He didn't mention the encrypted files, the Hargrove family, or the secret room in the basement. He gave her only the exact amount of information needed for Genevieve to act on her instinct for self-preservation, because Kessler didn't care about Genevieve. He cared about Prescott being distracted, and Genevieve, when frightened, would create exactly the kind of interference Kessler needed in order to do what he truly wanted, quietly pull the entire Eastern Underground financial network out of Sterling Crest before Prescott had time to notice. Genevieve was a chess piece. She didn't know that. She thought she was protecting herself. In truth, she was working for Kessler without being paid a single cent. And she was very good at it. Genevieve didn't attack Merritt directly. She attacked through the system. Merritt's employment contract was temporary, renewed every 6 months. Genevieve had enough connections inside human resources to make sure this cycle's contract wouldn't be renewed. Completely legal. No reason required. A temporary contract carried no obligation of renewal. At the same time, she arranged an internal audit aimed at Merritt's data access procedures over the past 4 years. If the audit found that she had accessed files outside the scope of her work, she wouldn't only lose her job, she could be sued for a security violation. But Genevieve was only one front. Kessler opened the second front. He didn't use the corporate system. He used the outside system, the one he had controlled long before Prescott inherited anything. Merritt's bank account was frozen because of an anti-suspicious transaction review procedure. Her landlord called to inform her that her lease wouldn't be renewed. 2 blows from outside the building, with no fingerprints, no connection to Sterling Crest on any piece of paper. In 4 days, Merritt lost her employment contract, was placed under audit, lost her home, and had her bank account frozen. 4 strikes, and not one of them left a visible handprint. On the afternoon of the 5th day, Merritt sat at her desk on the 12th floor. In front of her was the email from Human Resources, notifying her that her contract wouldn't be renewed. Beside it was the audit notice. Her phone had just received a call from the bank, informing her that her account had been temporarily locked. And in the pocket of her coat, she still had $47 in cash, money she always kept in her wallet, every day, never depositing everything into the bank. The habit came from the years she had spent growing up in the social care system, which had taught her one simple lesson: always have cash, because the system can stop being trustworthy at any moment. She stood, went down to the 1st floor, bought a cup of black coffee and a sandwich from the vending machine, returned to her desk, ate, drank, opened her laptop, worked. The 4 walls were closing in around her. She knew it. She could feel the pressure coming from every side, the kind of pressure that would make most people react by calling someone, asking someone for help, or running. Merritt didn't call. She didn't ask. She didn't run. She sat at her desk, eating the sandwich with one hand, typing with the other, and continued doing the daily work assigned to her as though nothing had happened. Because she knew that among all the things they could take from her, there was one thing they couldn't take. She was still thinking, still analyzing, and still sitting right here. Beckett came to the room on the 12th floor at 3 o'clock that same afternoon, holding a thin stack of papers inside a clear plastic folder. He knocked once, didn't wait for an answer, opened the door, and stepped in. His eyes passed over Merritt's desk in less than a second. the wrapper from a vending machine sandwich, folded neatly beside the keyboard. A plastic cup of coffee from the machine on the first floor, the kind of coffee no one in this building would drink if they had any other choice. Very different from the black coffee Merritt brewed for herself every morning in the small pot she kept on her desk. That pot was still in the corner of the desk, but today it was empty. Beckett didn't comment. He placed the papers on the desk in front of her. Audit paperwork. It starts next Monday. They'll review every file you've accessed in 4 years. Merritt looked at the stack of papers. She didn't open it. Then she looked back at Beckett. Does the scope of the review include files that have been deleted from the system? She asked. Beckett tilted his head slightly. That question told him she knew the files had been deleted, and she knew that he knew she knew, but neither of them said that aloud. The scope of the review is based on system access logs, he said. Everything you've opened, downloaded, or copied in the past 4 years has been recorded. The batch of encrypted files I was restoring before I was moved up here, Merritt said. Her voice even, as if she were reading the heading of a report, was assigned to me by the basement manager. I have a work assignment email, clearly stating the scope, the start date, and the type of files to be processed. Every file I accessed in that batch fell within the scope of the task I was given. Beckett didn't react. He waited. If that assignment email has also been deleted from the system, Merritt continued, the same way the email I sent to the technical department was deleted, the same way the entire batch of files I spent 3 weeks restoring was deleted, then this is no longer a story about an employee accessing files beyond her scope. It's a story about someone systematically destroying documents. And when someone deletes evidence, they create new evidence. Evidence that there was something that needed to be deleted. Silence. Beckett looked at her. Not the same assessing look from that first meeting on the 40th floor. A different kind of look. The look of a man who had just stepped into a familiar room and discovered the furniture had been rearranged without his knowledge. You prepared that answer before I came, he said. It wasn't a question. I prepared that answer the day the data was deleted, she said. When a system starts erasing traces, the next logical step is to open an audit and blame the person who found them. I didn't need anyone to tell me that. The data showed it. Beckett stood still for a few more seconds. Then he reached into the pocket of his suit jacket, took out a small USB drive with no label, and placed it on the desk beside the audit papers. He didn't explain. He didn't say what it was. He simply set it down, looked at it, then looked at her. Not from me, he said. Then he stood and walked out. He didn't look back. The door closed behind him. Merritt looked at the USB drive on the desk. Small, black, unlabeled. She picked it up and plugged it into her laptop. Inside were 2 folders. The first folder contained a full backup of the encrypted file batch that had been deleted from the system. The data from her 3 weeks of work was intact. Every file, every line, every layer of encryption she had decoded. Someone had backed them up before deletion, or someone had restored them after deletion. Either way, that person had the highest level of access to the system. That person wasn't Beckett. The second folder contained Sterling Crest board voting records from the past 5 years. Every meeting, every agenda item, every vote from every board member, all in PDF files, exported outside the system. If the audit reviewed Merritt's access logs, they wouldn't find anything. She hadn't accessed the system to obtain these files. She was only reading them from a USB drive no one admitted placing on her desk. Merritt sat and stared at the screen. She understood. This USB drive wasn't only data, it was a shield and a weapon, given to her by the man at the head of the table on the 40th floor, the man she had only seen through a soundproof glass door and had never spoken to directly. He didn't call her up. He didn't promise protection. He didn't explain. He simply placed what she needed somewhere she could reach it, and left her to decide what to do with it. And the way he had placed it, through Beckett, in an unlabeled USB drive, as offline files, showed that he had thought of every way this drive could be used against her, and had removed each one before it ever reached her hands. She unplugged the USB drive, put it into the inside pocket of her coat, in the same place as the leather-bound notebook. The next morning, when Merritt opened the door to the room on the 12th floor, she stopped on the threshold. Inside the room, beside the wall opposite her desk, there was a small sofa that hadn't been there the night before. Beside it was a neatly folded blanket, and the lock on her office door had been replaced with a new one, the kind with its own personal code. No handover paperwork, no notification email, no explanation from anyone. Merritt looked at the sofa, the blanket, the new lock. She understood everything without needing anyone to say a word. She stepped inside, closed the door, entered the new lock code someone had stuck on a small piece of paper on the inside of the door handle, and sat down at her desk. Merritt didn't sleep for 2 nights in a row. Not because she was afraid, because of the data. The USB drive contained the board voting records from the past 5 years, and Merritt read them the way she read everything. Not by reading the content, but by reading the structure. Who voted with whom? Who changed positions after which meeting? Who always voted in one direction no matter what the proposal was? Data didn't lie if you knew how to ask the right questions, and Merritt knew how to ask. The Sterling Crest board had 7 members. 4 had voted as a unified bloc for more than 3 years, ever since Genevieve Ashford had begun appearing at Prescott's side. 2 were neutral, the kind of neutral that belonged to people who wanted to keep their seats, so they didn't stand with any side until they knew for certain which side would win. 1 was an elder member, close to retirement, who voted according to conscience or habit, depending on the day. 4 people in Genevieve's faction. Merritt read each person's voting history carefully, then compared it against the original ownership records from the USB drive, and she found what she was looking for. 2 of the 4 members in Genevieve's faction owned personal shares in Sterling Crest through subsidiary companies. Those shares were calculated based on the current ownership structure, the structure in which the entire Hargrove family portion had been transferred to Devane. If Hargrove ownership were restored, the holdings of those 2 people would be diluted. They weren't voting with Genevieve out of loyalty. They were voting because of money. And money could be measured, predicted, and most importantly, proven. Merritt prepared 2 sets of files. She called them Layer 1 and Layer 2. Layer 1. Evidence of Hargrove ownership. The business registration record from 30 years ago. The ratio of 50. The transfer document from the time of the takeover. The civil records showing that the notary had died before the signing date. The court records showing that her father's complaint had been dismissed. Historical truth, presented through public data, anyone could verify. Layer 2. Board voting analysis. The identities of the 2 members with personal shares tied to the current ownership structure. Evidence of conflicts of interest. And the forged notary signature record from the time of the takeover, compared against the notary's date of death, enough to take to court if someone wanted to. Legal truth. The kind of truth that could destroy. She called Beckett. She didn't call Prescott. She called the exact person she knew would move the information to the right place without asking one more question. Beckett came to the room on the 12th floor. Merritt placed the 2 sets of files on the desk, each in a separate folder, clearly marked. Layer 1 is what the board needs to see, she said. Layer 2 is what the board doesn't want anyone to see. I'm only sending Layer 1. I'm keeping Layer 2. Beckett opened Layer 1 and skimmed through it. Then he looked at the Layer 2 folder without opening it. He understood without needing to read. When she said, "I'm keeping it," it meant she knew what Layer 2 could do, and she was choosing not to use it. But by letting him know it existed, she wanted the man on the 40th floor to know she had it. "Do you know you just gave him a reason to clean out half the board?" Beckett said, his voice unchanged, as if he were asking about the weather. "I didn't give him a reason," Merritt said. "I gave him data. He decides for himself what to do with it." Beckett looked at her, longer than he ever had before. Then he picked up Layer 1, stood, and left. Layer 2 remained on Merritt's desk, sealed inside its folder. 2 days later, the board meeting took place exactly as scheduled. The official agenda on paper, review of the audit petition, and reassessment of a temporary employee contract. The real agenda, deciding the fate of Merritt Gale. But 2 hours before the meeting, Prescott Devane met privately with each board member, one by one, in his office on the 40th floor, 15 minutes each. No one knew what he said. No one knew what he showed them. 7 meetings, 7 times the door opened and closed, 7 faces walking out with different expressions that the secretary outside couldn't read. The meeting began at 2 in the afternoon. 7 members took their seats at the table. Prescott wasn't present. He didn't need to be. He had already said what needed to be said. 10 minutes after the chairperson finished reading the audit petition, 2 members from the 4-person block in Genevieve's faction asked to speak. Both used the same phrase, almost word for word. "I would like to recuse myself from this vote," due to a personal conflict of interest. 2 withdrew. The block of 4 became 2. The 2 neutral members looked at each other, then looked down at the documents. The elder member sat still, his face expressionless. The petition was brought to a vote. Not enough votes. Dismissed. The audit was cancelled. Merritt Gale's employment contract was extended for 6 months, according to proper procedure. On the 12th floor, Merritt didn't know the result until she received the email from Human Resources at 4 in the afternoon. She read the email, closed the laptop, looked out the small window at the far end of the room, where the late afternoon light of Chicago slanted in and drew a long strip of brightness across the floor. Layer 2 still lay on her desk, sealed inside its folder. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. Her father's final wish had been written very clearly. Hatred will turn you into what they want you to become. She could use Layer 2 to destroy. She chose not to. That wasn't weakness. That was the strongest thing she had. But the meeting wasn't completely over yet. After 2 members recused themselves from the vote, and the petition was dismissed for lack of votes, Aldrich Kane, the man seated closest to the far end of the table among the 5 who remained, raised his hand. Kane was the second longest-serving member of the board, part of Genevieve's faction, and the kind of man Merritt had read enough meeting minutes to know would never accept an outcome without checking the source. "I want to see the original evidence," Kane said. "Not a copy. Not a summary. The original document that someone used to persuade my 2 colleagues to recuse themselves from the vote." The conference room went silent. The chairperson looked toward Prescott's empty seat, then looked at Beckett, who was standing by the door. Beckett didn't react. He only looked toward the conference room door. The door opened. Merritt stepped in. She hadn't been invited. She had been standing in the hallway since before the meeting began, sitting on the waiting chair beside the elevator, holding a file folder in her hand. She knew Kane's question would come. She knew because she had read 5 years of board meeting minutes. Kane always asked to see the source. In 43 recorded meetings, he had requested original documents 31 times. That wasn't a prediction. That was statistics. She walked straight to the conference table. She looked at no one except Kane. She placed the file folder on the tabletop, opened it, and arranged 3 things side by side. The original printout from the encrypted file batch in the basement, her handwritten notes cross-checking the data, and the copy of the public court record from Cook County that she had found at the Harold Washington Library. The encrypted data was found in the file batch, from the founding to the takeover period, she said, her voice steady, neither rising nor falling, the voice of someone reading the result of an analysis. "The content matches the public business registration records at the county court. The original printout is here. The cross-checked notes are here. The public records can be verified by anyone." Kane looked at the documents on the table. Then he looked up at her. "Who are you?" "Merritt Gale, data analysis, 12th floor. Before that, basement. Silence." Not the kind of silence in a conference room waiting for someone to continue. The kind of silence that belonged to people processing information they hadn't prepared themselves to receive. A girl from the basement had just walked into the boardroom, placed documents on the table, and answered a question with 2 words, without needing anything else. Merritt stood calmly. Her hands rested naturally at her sides, not crossed, not clasped, holding nothing. She stood like someone who didn't need any prop at all to occupy space in a room. Kane looked down at the documents. He turned through the printout, comparing it with the court records. It took about 1 minute. Then he pushed the documents back toward her. "Fine. 1 word." Merritt gathered the documents into the folder, gave the conference table a nod, turned, and walked out. She didn't look back. The door closed behind her. 15 minutes later, the meeting officially ended. The audit petition was dismissed. Merritt Gale's employment contract was extended according to proper procedure. On the 40th floor, in his private office, Prescott sat behind his desk. Beckett stood across from him. "Layer 2, Prescott said. His voice was low, brief, the kind of voice that didn't ask but ordered an answer. "What does she have?" Beckett looked at him. "Enough to take the entire board to court. Evidence of the forged notary signature, comparing the notary's date of death with the signing date on the transfer document. Her father's complaint file. Analysis of the personal conflicts of interest involving the 2 members who just recused themselves. All of it systematic, cross-checked, and supported by source citations." Silence. "And she chose not to use it," Beckett added. Prescott didn't move. He sat still, both hands resting on the desk, looking at Beckett with the kind of gaze Beckett had seen enough over the years to know it was the gaze of a man recalculating an entire equation he had thought he had already solved. "Who taught her to play like this?" Prescott asked. Beckett answered without hesitation. "No one. That's the problem." Genevieve wasn't the kind of person who accepted losing without understanding why she had lost. Immediately after the meeting, she began digging. Who had prepared the file that made 2 board members recuse themselves? Prescott didn't do that kind of work himself. He gave orders, and other people carried them out. Beckett was his right hand, but Beckett didn't have the financial data analysis expertise to cross-check voting records against personal shareholdings through subsidiary companies. Whoever had done it had to be someone who knew how to read numbers, knew how to ask the right questions, and had access to internal data. Genevieve narrowed the list. There weren't many people in the corporation who met all 3 conditions, and the name that kept appearing at the edge of every unusual event over the past month: the basement contract employee moved to the 12th floor, the irregular performance review conducted by Beckett, the girl who had walked into the boardroom and placed documents on the table as though she were placing a chess piece. That name was Merritt Gale. Genevieve wasn't completely certain, but she didn't need to be certain. She called Kessler. Kessler listened, and this time, he didn't merely suggest. He acted, not because Genevieve asked him to, but because Kessler knew the basement girl was holding something that could change the entire ownership structure of Sterling Crest. If the Hargrove family were restored, every profit-sharing arrangement between Kessler and Devane would have to be renegotiated. Merritt wasn't only a threat to Genevieve. She was a threat to Kessler himself. Kessler's order was simple. Get the notebook. Get any copies she has. Don't draw attention. That night, 10:45. The basement parking garage was almost empty. Merritt stepped out of the elevator, her handbag on her shoulder, her footsteps echoing across the concrete floor. Her car was parked in the farthest corner because contract employees didn't have assigned parking spaces. She had just unlocked the car when a hand held the door from behind. A large hand, gripping tight. She turned her head. 2 men. One was holding the car door, the other stood beside her, reaching for the strap of the handbag on her shoulder. Merritt didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't yank the bag back. She stood still, her back against the car, and looked straight into the eyes of the man holding her bag strap. "That notebook has nothing you need," she said, her voice even, not trembling, the voice of someone stating a fact, not begging. "But if you take it, I'll make sure everyone knows you came here." The man holding the bag hesitated, only for 1 second. But it was long enough. Footsteps sounded at the far end of the parking garage. Not fast. Not running. A normal, steady stride. The kind of stride that belonged to someone who didn't need to hurry, because he knew that wherever he arrived, everything there would stop. Prescott Devane stepped out of the darkness between 2 rows of cars. Behind him, about 10 steps away, Beckett stopped and stood still, both hands resting at his sides. Beckett didn't come any closer. He didn't need to. The 2 men saw Prescott and released their hands at the same time. The man holding the bag let the handbag strap fall back onto Merritt's shoulder. The man holding the car door stepped back, not because they were afraid of violence, because they recognized who was walking toward them, and in the world they lived in, realizing that Prescott Devane was looking straight at your face was enough for survival instinct to speak. Prescott stopped 3 steps away from them. He looked at each man's face, slowly, carefully, the kind of look that belonged to a man committing something to memory, and both of them knew what it meant to be remembered by Prescott Devane. He looked at the older man, Wes. His voice was low, ordinary, neither rising nor falling, as if he were calling someone's name at dinner. "You run errands for Kessler on the south side. You have a stable life outside this job." He paused for half a beat. "I suggest you keep it." Wes went pale. The color drained from his face in the way only real fear can create. Not fear of being hit or threatened, but fear because the man standing in front of him had just read his life aloud in the most ordinary voice in the world. "Go home," Prescott said. "Tomorrow morning, call Kessler and tell him that the next time he wants something from this building, he can come get it himself, in person." The 2 men left, quickly, without looking back. Their footsteps echoed across the concrete, then disappeared behind the stairwell door. The parking garage fell silent again. Only the steady sound of the ventilation system ran across the ceiling. Prescott turned to Merritt. and his voice changed, not in a deliberate way, not because he was trying to sound gentler or softer. His voice was simply different when he looked at her, different in a way he couldn't control and perhaps didn't even recognize. "Are you all right?" Merritt was adjusting the handbag strap on her shoulder. Her hand was trembling slightly, but the movement was still controlled. She looked up at him. "I'm fine. Thank you." He nodded. He said nothing more. He walked beside her toward the car and opened the door for her. She got in. He closed the door. He didn't touch her. He didn't ask anything else. Beckett drove up from the front of the parking garage. Merritt started the engine, backed out, and left. Prescott stood in the basement parking garage, both hands in the pockets of his coat, watching the taillights of her car until it turned up the ramp and disappeared behind the concrete wall. Beckett sat in the car, 10 steps away, watching through the rearview mirror. He saw his boss standing there, alone, watching the car of a basement girl until there was nothing left to see. And in all the years Beckett had worked for Prescott Devane, this was the first time he had ever seen that man stand and watch anyone leave. The parking garage incident changed everything, not because those two men were dangerous, but because Prescott recognized the name of the man who had sent them. Wes ran errands for Kessler, and Kessler, the man Prescott had called Uncle for 16 years, the only man who had stayed until the very end of his father's funeral, had just sent people to take something out of the hands of a girl Prescott was protecting. That wasn't a mistake. That was a declaration. Prescott didn't call. He didn't send a message. He arranged a dinner. Private room. 2 people. No Beckett. No one else. Kessler arrived on time. He always arrived on time. 60 years old, gray-haired, with a pleasant smile. The kind of man anyone would meet and think, this man probably does charity work. He sat across from Prescott, opened his napkin, placed it on his lap, and began talking about the real estate market in the East as though this were an ordinary dinner between 2 close men. Prescott listened, nodded at the right places, answered in the right rhythm. The conversation drifted through 15 minutes of sentences they both knew didn't matter. Then Prescott set down his knife, wiped his hands with the napkin, and said, his voice unchanged from 1 second earlier, "You're moving money through 3 shell companies in Delaware that I didn't approve." Kessler didn't stop chewing. He had been playing this game longer than Prescott had been alive. The first instinct was not to react. Asset restructuring. Routine business. "Restructuring has a path," Prescott said. "This has an escape route." Kessler finished chewing, swallowed, set down his knife, looked at Prescott. The smile was still on his face, but his eyes were no longer smiling. "You've been monitoring my accounts? I monitor everything that moves inside my system. Your money moves inside my system." Silence. Kessler leaned back in his chair. He looked at Prescott with a look he had probably used on Prescott's father 30 years ago. The look of a man who had given himself the right to judge the next generation. "You're like your father," Kessler said. "You see everything, but your father knew when to close his eyes." "My father is gone," Prescott said, "and one of the reasons is because he closed his eyes too often." That sentence hung in the air. Kessler didn't argue. He knew it was true. Prescott's father had closed his eyes to too many things, trusted too many people, and in the end, died in his director's chair from a heart attack the doctor called accumulated stress, though everyone close enough knew that stress had a very specific name. "I know you're connecting 3 Eastern partners," Prescott continued. "I know you're pulling out the network. And I know you used Genevieve to create internal disruption so I'd be distracted. You introduced her into my family 3 years ago not because she was suitable, but because you needed someone of yours beside me." Kessler didn't deny it. He only looked at Prescott. And in that gaze there was something almost like surprise. The surprise of a man who planted a tree and one day discovered it had grown taller than him. "So what are you going to do?" Kessler asked. "Call the lawyers? Call the federal agents? If I call the federal agents, you lose your freedom. If I call the lawyers, you lose your money." "I'm not calling anyone." Kessler frowned. This wasn't the answer he had calculated. "If you want to leave, then leave," Prescott said. "Take the Eastern Network with you. I won't keep it." "That's all?" "That's all. But whatever you take is all you get. You don't come back. You don't contact anyone still working with me. And you never mention my name. In any conversation, with anyone, anywhere, you disappear, as if you never existed." A long silence. Kessler looked at him. Then he laughed. A dry, short sound. the laugh of a man realizing that the child, whose shoulder he had once patted in comfort at a funeral, had now grown far beyond him. "Your father wouldn't have let me walk away," Kessler said. His voice shifted from the language of uncle and nephew into the raw bluntness of me and you halfway through the sentence, as though the polite shell had just fallen off. "I know," Prescott said. "That's the difference between my father and me." Kessler looked at him for a few more seconds. Then he stood, placed the napkin on the table beside his half-eaten plate, looked at Prescott one last time. "You'll regret this," he said. "Maybe," Prescott said, "but I'll regret it with a clean conscience." "You won't." Kessler walked out of the room. The door closed. His footsteps faded down the hallway. Prescott remained seated alone. The private room was quiet. In front of him, the chair across the table was empty. His glass of water was still full, untouched. His plate of food had barely been disturbed. He looked at that empty chair, the chair where, 16 years earlier, at his father's funeral, the man sitting in it had placed a hand on the shoulder of a 17-year-old boy and said, "From now on, if anything happens, call me." And that boy had called, for 16 years, until today. Prescott sat still, looking at the empty chair. Then he stood, buttoned his suit jacket, and walked out of the room. 2 a.m. The 12th floor was silent. Merritt sat in front of her laptop, the glow of the screen the only thing lighting the room. She was cross-checking the financial data set she had begun organizing after the board meeting. Work she had assigned to herself because she couldn't sleep, and because Data never asked her whether she was all right. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. She stopped typing, listened. She was used to the footsteps on this floor. Security made rounds at 12 o'clock and 4 o'clock, steady and quick, soft-soled shoes. The night shift cleaner came through at 1 o'clock. Light steps, pulling a cart. But these footsteps were different. Heavier, slower, uneven, as though the person walking had not fully decided where he was going, and she recognized that sound. She had heard it in the parking garage, in the hallway of the 40th floor, when Beckett led her past the glass conference room. But this time, those footsteps were different. This time, they carried the weight of something that wasn't the body. She stood, opened the door. Prescott Devane stood in the hallway, one shoulder leaning against the wall, 2 steps from her door. He wasn't drunk. Merritt knew he didn't drink while working, and for Prescott, it was always time to work. But something had broken. She saw it in his eyes. Not anger, not the kind of exhaustion that came from lack of sleep. It was a look she knew very well, because she had seen it in the mirror for 13 years. The look of someone who had just lost something they knew they would never get back, and was standing in the hollow space it had left behind, not yet knowing how long they would have to stand there. She didn't ask why he was there, didn't ask what had happened. She opened the door wider and stepped aside. He walked in, went straight to the chair in the right corner of the desk, the same chair he had sat in when he came here after the board meeting. Sat down, clasped his hands in front of him, looked down at the floor. Merritt closed the door, went to the small kitchenette in the corner of the room, made coffee, set the cup on the table in front of him, then returned to her seat, sat down, and continued working on the laptop. She didn't look at him, didn't ask, didn't press. Half an hour passed. No one said anything. There was only the sound of Merritt typing, light and steady, and the soft hum of the air conditioner overhead. Then he spoke. His voice was lower than usual, the voice of a man speaking to himself and, by chance, being heard by someone else. Kessler. He was the only one who stayed until the end of my father's funeral. I was 17. People came, shook my hand, said a few words, then left. He stayed. When no one else was there, he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "From now on, if anything happens, call me." I called. For 16 years. Merritt didn't stop typing, but she was listening. He knew she was listening, and that was why he continued. Today, I let him go. I let him take the Eastern Network with him. I didn't stop him, didn't retaliate, because if I hadn't let him go, I would have had to do something I didn't want to remember doing. Silence. Then he spoke again, and Merritt realized he wasn't changing the subject. He was following a line of thought that had been running through his mind all night, from Kessler to his father, because in his mind, those 2 men had never truly been separate. My father was more like Kessler than I want to admit. Both of them believed that if you wanted to keep something, you had to take it from someone else. My father built Sterling Crest that way. Kessler stayed in power that way. And I inherited all of it without asking what it was built from. He stopped, for a long time. Back then, during the takeover, I was just a young boy. I didn't know what my father did to the Hargrove family. Merritt stopped typing. For the first time since he had entered the room, she didn't turn her chair around. But she stopped. "I know," she said. 2 words. "Enough. I'm not apologizing on my father's behalf," he said. "My apology has no value for that. But you need to know this. When I inherited the corporation, I didn't know there was buried data. I didn't know you were in the basement. I didn't know the Hargrove family had been erased. And now you know," she said. "Now I know." Silence. She still hadn't turned to look at him, but she spoke, her voice soft, steady, not comforting him, only telling the truth. "The day you no longer care about not becoming the man who did that, that's the day you should worry." He didn't answer at once. She heard him exhale, slow and heavy. Then she turned her chair around, looked at him for the first time since he had sat down. His eyes were red, tired, bare in a way she suspected no one in his life had ever been allowed to see. "You don't have to be strong here," she said. "This room isn't a boardroom." He picked up the cup of coffee in front of him. It had gone cold long ago. He turned it slowly in his hands, looking at the flat black surface inside. He didn't drink. He only held it, as though he needed to hold something so his hands wouldn't be empty. He didn't stand. He didn't say anything more. She turned back to the laptop, kept typing, and they remained there, 2 people in a small room on the 12th floor, at 3 a.m, one working and the other learning how to sit still in a room where he didn't need to control anything at all. It was the most intimate moment either of them had ever shared with anyone. Not because of what they said, but because they didn't need to say anything more. When Merritt opened her eyes, she was lying on the sofa in the room on the 12th floor. A blanket was pulled over her shoulders. The office door was closed, locked from the inside with the code lock. Early morning light slipped through the small window at the far end of the room. She looked toward the chair in the right corner of the desk. Empty. The cup of coffee she had made at 2 a.m. was still on the table, completely cold now. Prescott had left before she woke, and she didn't know when he had gone. But on her desk, beside the laptop, there was something that hadn't been there last night. A stack of documents inside a plastic folder, unmarked, with no notes. She opened it. Inside was an internal report on the Eastern Financial Network Kessler had just taken with him. Projected losses, gaps in cash flow, a list of affected partners, short-term and long-term risks. All of it had been printed from the highest level internal system, the kind of document only the person sitting on the 40th floor had the authority to export. He didn't ask her to analyze it. He didn't write a note. He didn't send an email. He simply placed the file on her desk, beside the laptop, the same way she placed a second cup of coffee in the corner of the desk every morning, whether she knew he would come or not. No words, just placed it there. If she wanted to, she would understand. She understood. Merritt spent 3 days analyzing it, not analyzing the underground network or the structure of power. She knew nothing about that world, and she didn't need to know. She analyzed what she did best: financial data, cash inflows and outflows, transaction histories, debt. She read the numbers the way she read her mother tongue, and the numbers told her a very clear story. In the list of Eastern partners Kessler had taken with him, there were 3 small companies with one thing in common. All 3 carried large loans from a financial entity directly tied to Kessler. Those loans weren't on the official books. They were hidden inside cross-transactions among multiple shell companies. But if you knew how to ask the right questions, the money trail pointed to one place. Those 3 companies hadn't followed Kessler out of loyalty. They had followed him because he held their debt. If Sterling Crest bought those debts from Kessler's entity, the 3 companies would owe Sterling Crest instead of Kessler. And when you owed someone, you stood on that person's side. Merritt wrote the analysis on a loose sheet of paper. A 4-sheet, filled with her sharp, analytical script. She wrote down the names of the 3 companies, the debt figures, the intermediary entity, and the plan. Purchased the debt, estimated cost, projected result. She folded the paper into quarters and placed it in the right corner of the desk, where he usually sat, beneath the morning coffee she had already made for him. The next morning, Prescott came. He sat in the chair, picked up the cup of coffee, and saw the folded paper underneath. He set the cup aside, opened the paper. Read. She sat at the desk across from him, eyes on the screen, not looking at him, but she heard the sound of the paper turning, heard him read it again from the beginning, slower than the first time. Then came the sound of the paper being folded again. He put the paper into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He didn't place it back on the desk. He didn't hand it to Beckett. He put it in his pocket, close to his body. "These 3 debts," he said. "Are you certain?" "The data is certain," she said, still looking at the screen. "People are never certain, but the probability is high." Silence for a moment. Then she heard something she had never heard from him before. The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. It wasn't a smile, only the shadow of one, passing quickly, like late afternoon light sliding across glass and disappearing. "Your coffee is still terrible," he said. She didn't look up. "You still drink it." He picked up the cup, drank, and they sat there, in the room on the 12th floor, morning light coming through the window, saying nothing else, because nothing else needed to be said. 2 weeks later, the 3 Eastern partners returned to Sterling Crest. Kessler lost almost half of the network he had just taken away. The debt purchases were carried out quickly, cleanly, through 3 separate transactions approved only by Prescott. No one in the corporation knew who had analyzed that move. Beckett knew because Prescott told him. Beyond that, the information existed on a single A4 sheet written in blue ink, folded into quarters, now locked inside a drawer of Prescott Devane's desk on the 40th floor. After the 3 Eastern partners returned, Prescott began giving Merritt other work, not the work of a contract employee on the 12th floor. Real work. The first deal was an acquisition of an energy company in the Midwest. Prescott sent the internal documents down to her room through Beckett, with no explanation, only one handwritten note attached. Risk analysis, needed before Thursday. She finished the analysis before Wednesday. He called her up to the 40th floor for a meeting that was expected to last 20 minutes. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Not because she gave a long presentation, but because she asked questions back. Questions he couldn't answer right away. The kind of questions the head of a corporation was rarely asked because no one dared to ask them, or no one thought to ask them. She didn't ask to challenge him. She asked because the data had places that didn't match, and she didn't accept anything that didn't match. Prescott sat and listened. He answered when he had an answer. He stayed silent when he didn't. And for the first time in a very long while, he sat in a meeting where he wasn't the only person thinking. After that, he began sending internal documents before every major meeting. No explanation, no request, just sending them. And every morning, before 7 o'clock, there was a note written in blue ink on his desk on the 40th floor. Small, neat, precise handwriting, quickly analyzing the points he needed to pay attention to in the document of a class. She left the notes there before he arrived, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world, and he read them before every meeting as though he had been reading her notes his entire life. Everything happened slowly. There was no moment of declaration, no conversation about what this relationship was. There was only work, data, blue ink notes, and 2 cups of coffee. Merritt didn't remember exactly when the 2 cups of coffee began. She only knew that one morning, while making coffee in the small pot in the corner of the room, she poured 2 cups instead of 1. Her cup went on her desk. The second cup went in the right corner of the desk, where he usually sat. She didn't think anything when she did it. Her hand poured on its own. As though it had already belonged to a habit her mind had not yet had time to recognize. On mornings when he came, he sat in the chair, picked up the cup, and drank. No comment. On mornings when he didn't come, the cup of coffee cooled slowly in the corner of the desk. Merritt looked at it. She didn't throw it away. She left it there until noon, then washed it. She didn't analyze why she did that. Merritt analyzed everything: cash flow, ownership structures, voting records. But she didn't analyze that cup of coffee. Maybe because she knew the answer would make everything more complicated. Maybe because she wasn't ready for complicated yet. One morning, he came earlier than usual. She had just set the second cup down in the corner of the desk, and hadn't had time to sit down. The door opened. He stepped in, looked at the desk. 2 cups of coffee, steam still rising. He looked at the cup in the right corner of the desk. His cup, placed in the right position, at the right corner of the desk, at the exact distance from the edge where he usually rested his hand. She had made it for him before knowing whether he would come. She had done it every morning. And on the mornings he didn't come, she had let it sit there and go cold until noon instead of pouring it out. He sat down, picked up the cup, drank, gave a slight nod, as though this was an agreement they had both just signed without needing any paper. From that day on, he came every morning. The file for restoring the Hargrove family's ownership rights required many documents. The corporation's lawyers sent Merritt a list: her birth certificate, her mother's birth certificate, proof of bloodline, and any documents confirming the connection between her and the Hargrove family. She already had most of them, or knew how to obtain them. There was only one thing she had to request officially: her mother's birth certificate. She sent the request to the Illinois Civil Records Office. Standard procedure. Fill out the form, pay the fee, wait 7 business days. The reply came to her room on the 12th floor on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, inside a large brown envelope stamped by the office. She opened the envelope. Inside were 2 documents: the birth certificate of Josephine Hargrove Gale, born in Chicago, Illinois, and a death certificate. Merritt hadn't requested a death certificate. The office had included it because, according to procedure, when the person being requested had passed away, both documents were sent together. Josephine Hargrove Gale died 2 years later. And on the line for cause, where she had prepared herself to read the word illness or the name of some disease, because that was what she had been told her entire life, that her mother had been sick, that her mother hadn't survived. The line said something else. The official cause wasn't illness. Her mother had left this world in silence, after 2 years of being unable to find her way through the grief of losing Merritt's father. Merritt sat at her desk, holding the death certificate in her hand, and for the first time in years, the layer of calm she had built since she lost her family, the layer of calm that had kept her standing through the social care system, through the years of surviving on her own, through the basement, through Genevieve, through the parking garage, through the boardroom, that layer cracked. She didn't cry loudly. She only stopped breathing for 1 beat. Then her hands began to shake. She folded the paper, very slowly, very carefully, with fingers that no longer completely obeyed her. She opened the leather-bound notebook and placed the death certificate inside, beside the page her father had written for her. Father and mother, side by side on paper, inside the notebook she had carried for so long. She closed the notebook, placed both hands on it, lowered her head. She had never known the truth until today. She had been told her mother was sick. She believed it. She didn't ask more because as a child, she hadn't known what she needed to ask. And later, she hadn't dared to ask because she was afraid of the answer. Merritt entered the social care system right after her mother was gone. A young child, completely alone. She sat that way until the light outside the window went completely out. 7 o'clock in the evening. The door opened. Prescott stepped in the way he had every evening lately, around the time he usually came to discuss the day's final work. But today the room was different. The lights were off. There was only the glow of the Chicago skyline outside the window, blue and pale yellow light slanting in. 2 cups of coffee sat on the desk, both stone cold, neither touched, and Merritt wasn't sitting straight. For the first time since he had known her, she wasn't sitting straight. He stopped at the door, looked, understood that something had happened without needing anyone to tell him. He closed the door behind him, walked to the desk, sat in his chair at the right corner. She didn't look up. She pushed the death certificate across the desk toward him, slowly, with her fingertips. He picked it up, read it. It took a moment, then he placed the paper back on the desk, face down. He didn't say he was sorry, didn't say, "I understand," didn't say anything. He reached across the desk, slowly, very slowly, as if approaching something he knew could break if touched too quickly. And he placed his hand down, not on her hand, on the leather-bound notebook. The notebook beneath both of her hands, the notebook that belonged to her father, the man who had died on Lakeshore Drive at 2 a.m. with no witnesses, because of Prescott's father. His hand rested on the notebook, beside hers, close enough for her to feel the warmth of his skin without touching. He touched the notebook, touched the only thing she had left of her father, and Merritt cried. Not much, not for long, not with any loud sound. Only water slipping from her eyes. Silent, soaking into the backs of her hands where they rested on the notebook. She cried for the first time since she lost everything. The first time in front of anyone. My mother couldn't get through it after my father died, she said, her voice flat, not accusing, only stating the truth. And I was just a child, alone. Prescott didn't answer. His hand remained on the notebook. After a while, she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, the way a child would, and sat straight again, slowly, as though she were putting herself back together piece by piece. I'm fine, she said. No, he said. You're not fine, and you don't need to be fine. She looked at him. In the faint light from the window, she couldn't clearly see his eyes, but she heard his voice, and that voice wasn't the voice of the man sitting at the head of the boardroom table on the 40th floor. It was the voice of a man saying the only true thing he knew for certain. Don't go, she said. He didn't go. The next morning, Merritt arrived at the room on the 12th floor at 6:30, almost an hour earlier than usual. Her eyes were slightly swollen, but her hair had been neatly brushed. Her shirt was clean, and she was wearing the same office shoes with the worn left heel that she wore every day. She turned on the lights, opened the small window to let in the early air, then went straight to the corner of the room to make coffee. 2 cups. Hers went on her desk. His went in the right corner of the desk. She sat down, opened her laptop, began working. Prescott arrived at 7:15. The door opened, the footsteps familiar. He looked at her. She knew he was looking, but she didn't raise her head. He sat in the chair, picked up the coffee, drank. She pushed a sheet of paper across the desk. It wasn't a financial analysis. It wasn't a work note. It was a list written in blue ink, neat, clear, line by line. Mother's birth certificate. Yes. Mother's death certificate. Yes. Father's death certificate. Yes. Official proof of bloodline. Need to request. Prescott read the list, then looked at her. I'll contact the Civil Records Office to request the proof of bloodline, she said. Her voice even, her working voice, the voice that would make anyone meeting her for the first time think she was talking about an ordinary project, not the family she had just discovered had been lost in a way no one had told her for all these years. This is my family. I'll be the one to complete the file for them. Not the lawyers, not the legal department. Me. Prescott looked at her. He had seen her calm when the data was deleted, seen her calm when she was cornered by 3 fronts at once, seen her calm in the boardroom, in front of people who had the power to decide her life, seen her calm when she was stopped in the parking garage late at night. But this morning's calm was different. This morning, it wasn't calm because she was used to it. This morning, it was calm because she had broken the night before, and this morning she had chosen to stand up. You don't have to, he began. I need to, she said. She didn't cut him off. It was only that the 2 voices met at the same time. My father fought for the Hargrove family and didn't get to finish. My mother carried the Hargrove name and never had the chance for anyone to know what that meant. I'll complete this file, in their names, through the proper process, 1 page at a time. Prescott nodded, once. Then he picked up the coffee, drank again, and opened the documents he had brought with him for work. She turned back to the screen. The room returned to its normal rhythm, the sound of keys being typed, the sound of paper turning, the sound of coffee being sipped in small mouthfuls. In the middle of the morning, while he was reading a report and she was cross-checking data on the screen, she spoke. She didn't look up. Her eyes stayed on the laptop. Her voice was quiet, ordinary, as if she were adding 1 more line of data to the bottom of a spreadsheet. Thank you for last night. He didn't look up either. His eyes stayed on the report. His voice was quiet too, ordinary too, as if he were adding 1 more line of data to the bottom of a spreadsheet. You would have done the same for me. I already did the same for you, she said. 3 weeks ago, at 2 a.m, silence. Not the heavy kind of silence. The kind of silence between 2 people who had just said what needed to be said and didn't need anything more. She heard him exhale, very softly, almost too softly to hear. Not a sigh, just the breath of a man who had just realized he wasn't alone anymore, and wasn't used to that feeling yet, and needed a moment for his body to adjust to the new reality. Then he turned the page of the report. She kept typing. The morning went on. 2 cups of coffee on the desk, 1 partly empty, 1 half full. Light from the small window fell into the room, growing warmer as the hours passed. And if someone had opened the door to the room on the 12th floor at 10 o'clock that morning, they would have seen 2 people sitting in silence, working across from each other at a desk, and they wouldn't have known that the night before, both of them had broken. and that this morning, both of them had chosen to stand up. Prescott didn't tell Merritt about the meeting. Not that morning, not the day before, not ever. He simply acted. The board meeting was called for 10 o'clock on Monday morning. 7 members received notice only 24 hours in advance, a window short enough that no one had time to prepare a strategy, but long enough that no one had an excuse to refuse attendance. The agenda written on the summons read, "Special meeting regarding corporate ownership structure. No further explanation. 10 o'clock. The conference room on the 40th floor. 7 members sat around the table. Prescott entered last, but he didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, both hands in his trouser pockets, his back straight, looking down at the 7 faces, looking up at him. In this conference room, the chair at the head of the table belonged to the person in command. Prescott didn't need the chair. He stood there, and the distance between him standing and them sitting said more than any opening statement could have. "I called this meeting to inform you," he said. "Not to discuss." Herrenveld, the eldest member, the one closest to retirement, raised his hand. "Every decision related to ownership structure requires a vote under the charter." Prescott looked at him. The charter of this corporation was written based on the transfer document from the time of the takeover. That transfer document bears the certification signature of a notary who had been dead for 2 months before the date written on the document. He paused for one beat, long enough for everyone in the room to process what they had just heard. "If you want to vote based on a forged document, I'm willing. But I'll have it recorded in the minutes that the board voted with full awareness that the legal foundation was fraudulent." The room fell silent. The kind of silence Merritt would have described, had she been there, as structured silence. Not silence because there was nothing left to say. Silence because everyone was recalculating their position on the board, while the board itself was being overturned. Aldrich Kane, whom Prescott had met privately before the previous meeting, spoke up. "Who provided this information?" "The corporation's own records," Prescott said, "stored inside the archive system whose maintenance budget you approve every year. The information wasn't hidden. It was simply forgotten, because no one thought there would ever be someone patient enough to read." Kane leaned forward. "You're proposing to redistribute shares based on a complaint from a contract employee?" Prescott looked at Kane. This time, he didn't tilt his head. He looked straight at him. "I'm correcting a seizure my father carried out 20 years ago. If you want to call that a contract employee's complaint, I suggest you ask your lawyer what a court would call it." No one spoke. Prescott let the silence hang in the room for a few more seconds. Then he said, his voice unchanged, as if reading the final line of a contract he had signed before entering the room. "The Hargrove family's ownership rights will be restored. The share ratio will be negotiated fairly by an independent third party. This isn't an opinion. This is the direction of the corporation. You may agree, or you may resign. I respect both choices." He left the room. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't need to. Outside in the hallway, Beckett was waiting. He had heard everything through the internal communication system Prescott never turned off during meetings, because Beckett needed to know everything that happened inside that room in order to prepare for everything that would happen after the door opened. 3 people will resign, Beckett said. 2, Prescott said, walking straight toward his office without slowing. "Kane will stay because he needs his pension. The 3rd will stay because she knows I'm right." Beckett watched him go. He didn't ask anything more. 15 years of working together had taught him that when Prescott sounded certain, Prescott was right. And today, Prescott wasn't only right. Today, Prescott had just stood before the board of directors of the corporation his father built, and said plainly that his father had seized what wasn't his. No cover, no softening, no other word. Seized, and he was correcting it. On the 12th floor, Merritt knew nothing about the meeting until 2 in the afternoon, when she received an email from the corporate legal department. Subject: Invitation to attend meeting regarding the process of restoring Hargrove family ownership rights. She read the email. Read it again. Then she looked toward the right corner of the desk. The 2nd cup of coffee was still there, still warm. He had come that morning, earlier than she had, drunk the coffee, then left before she realized it. He hadn't told her about the meeting. Not before, not after. He had simply finished what he had decided to do, then come to her room for coffee like every morning, then gone up to the 40th floor and overturned 20 years of hidden corporate history in front of 7 people who had the power to object. He didn't tell her because this wasn't a gift. It wasn't a favor. It wasn't a promise. This was the right thing. And the right thing didn't need an announcement. Genevieve Ashford left Sterling Crest on a Friday at the end of the month. She wasn't fired. She left on her own, because she was smart enough to know when the board had changed completely, and there was no longer any place left for her peace. Before leaving the building, she went down to the coffee shop on the ground floor. Merritt was sitting there, a cup of black coffee in front of her, reading documents on her phone. Genevieve sat down across from her, ordered an espresso, looked at Merritt. "I don't hate you," Genevieve said. "I want you to know that." "I know," Merritt said. "You were protecting your position. I understand." Genevieve gave a slight nod, stood, picked up her bag, walked out the door without looking back. On the table, the espresso she had ordered had just been brought over, still hot, untouched. Merritt looked at the espresso, then she pulled it toward herself and drank it all, because wasting coffee was a shame. A few months later, everything was different, and everything was still the same. Merritt was no longer on the 12th floor. Her new office was on the 38th floor, 2 floors below Prescott, with large windows looking out over the Chicago skyline. But the important things were still exactly where they belonged. The leather-bound notebook sat on the shelf beside the door, its cover worn, the leather darkened. Inside, between her blue ink notes and her father's legal handwriting, her mother's death certificate rested beside the line her father had written for her. 2 people, side by side on paper. On the wall opposite the desk, one document was framed. The founding registration of Sterling Crest Holdings, dated 30 years ago. 2 signatures, Devane and Hargrove. Prescott had placed it there without saying anything. Merritt had seen it and said nothing. It was there, the truth, hanging on the wall instead of buried beneath the basement. That was all. Blue ink on her fingertips. Still the same. She still took notes by hand, still wrote her analysis on paper before entering it into the computer, still left notes on his desk before 7 o'clock every morning. The office shoes with the worn left heel still sat under her desk. She had bought a new pair, but she still wore the old ones on the days when she needed to remember where she had come from. 2 cups of coffee on the desk. Hers was half empty. His was still full, a faint thread of steam rising from it. The door opened. No knock. Footsteps she had known by heart for a long time now, steady and certain. The steps of a man who knew where he was going and didn't need anyone to open the door first. Prescott sat down in the chair at the right corner of the desk, the chair he had brought up from the conference room on the 40th floor, because he had complained that the chairs here were too low. He picked up the coffee, drank. "The Western deal responded," he said. "Accepted? Or asking for more?" she asked, eyes on the screen. "Asking for more. But the way they're asking tells me they'll accept." She gave a slight nod. He set the cup down and picked up the blue ink note she had left on the desk the night before. Data analysis for the morning meeting. Small, neat, precise handwriting. He read, slowly, the way people read something they trust. Morning light came through the large glass windows and fell across the desk, warm and even. Below them, the Chicago skyline was waking, millions of people beginning a new day, and not one of them knew anything about the 2 people sitting in a room on the 38th floor, drinking coffee and needing no more words. Normal, for a girl orphaned so young, raised in the social care system with $47 in cash and a leather-bound notebook, and for a man who had inherited both an empire and his father's sins. Normal was the greatest luxury either of them had ever had. Not normal because it was easy. Normal because both of them had lived through enough of what wasn't normal to know exactly how precious it was. And it was enough. Exactly enough. Sometimes, the true value of a person doesn't lie in where they stand inside a system, but in the way they keep standing when the whole world tries to erase them. Merritt didn't win because she was stronger than the system. She won because she refused to let the system define who she was. And Prescott, the man who held everything in his hands except a clean conscience, chose the harder road, not to repeat his father's sins, even though the price was losing the closest person he had. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. Making things right isn't an apology. It's the act of changing reality, slowly, painfully, even when no one applauds. If this story touched you, I want to hear what you think. Would you stay or walk away if you were in Merritt's position? Share what you feel from your heart in the comments below. I read every single line. If you want stories like this to reach more people, please like and share the video with someone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories every day. I wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace every day. Goodbye, and I'll see you in the next video.